I'm going to need to adjust.
Hi everyone, thank you for being patient. So we are here at the South Pasadena Public Library, so thank you to the Public Library for hosting us. This is Women Who Submit, and we are doing a panel on applying for academic jobs. This event was made possible by Investing in Tomorrow organizational grant from the Central Cultural Innovation with support from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and also again the public library, the South Pasadena Public Library. Today we have two guest speakers. We have Cynthia Guardado, is a Salvadoran American poet and professor of English. She received her Master's of Fine Arts from California State University, Fresno, with an emphasis in poetry. Her poems have appeared in Huizache, Bazota Journal, the Acentos Review, the Packing House Review, Palabra, a magazine of Chicano literary art, Crate, and transcribed interviews with journalists in Cuban exile, Normando Hernandez Gonzalez, which were published in the Madrid Conversations, New Orleans Press. Her poems, Pilgrimage and The Only Apartment in the Building Without a Back Door, are forthcoming in an anthology about Inglewood. Her debut collection of poetry, Endeavor, was published by World Stage Press in 2017. She is a professor of English at Fullerton College, where her teaching is centered around contemporary works written by authors dedicated to social change in America. So Cynthia Guardado, thank you for being here. And then we also have Bernadette Murphy. She has published 4 books of narrative nonfiction, most recently Harley and Me, Embracing Risk on the Road to a More Authentic Life from Counterpoint Press. A hybrid narrative that combines memoir with research into neuroscience and biology. The book explores female risk-taking through the lens of her own experience of learning to ride a motorcycle at the age of 48, and makes a compelling case for how and why taking risks is a healthy part of an expansive life. She served as weekly book critic for the Los Angeles Times for 6 years and is currently an associate professor of creative writing for the MFA program at Antioch University, Los Angeles, where she heads up the creative nonfiction genre. This is Bernadette Murphy. So again, this is a talk on applying for academic jobs. Cynthia works at a community college, in the community college world, and Bernadette in the MFA world, so they're going to share their knowledge with us. And if you could both, I guess, Cynthia, if you could go first, just kind of introduce yourself and what you have to share with us. Okay.
Obviously, so you read my bio, so you got that part. I've been tenure track for 2 years now, so I'm halfway through my tenure review process at Fullerton College. It's a 4-year process. I think one of the things that's important to just say about that process is that, because I get questions about this still, is this, my tenure track position has nothing to do with publishing. So it is not a requirement of me to publish books in order to get tenure. At community college, it is completely student-centered. I'm under review every semester, and someone observes every single one of my classes. I have to turn in absolutely everything, which is really crazy, and that's the most stressful part. But it has nothing to do with publishing. Publishing, they're happy about it, right? They'll pay for me to go to conferences, things like that, to AWP, etc. I teach creative writing there. I run the literary magazine, but it doesn't have to. It's not pertinent to my position. Does that make sense? Yeah. Or or maintaining my position, let's say, right? That I do because I want to, which is nice. And then I think one of the overall things I want to say about getting my position is I was just barely finishing my last semester to complete 3 years of the minimum qualifications of adjuncting experience when I got hired. And there's absolutely no way I would have been able to get hired if I didn't have basically a team of women, and it was only women who helped me, a team of women who coached me through the process. Wow. If I had not been coached through that process, there's no way that I would be sitting here right now. And those 5 women helped me in all these different aspects, and most of them out of just their own generosity. One of them was a professor is a full-time professor at Long Beach City College where I was adjuncting, and she just chose to mentor me essentially. It wasn't at some schools they assign you a mentor, not there. that she just chose to do it, and connected me with another young Latina who had just gotten hired at, her name Leslie Tejada, who had just gotten hired at West LA College. And she was like, hey, I want you to meet this person. She just got hired. Maybe you all could like connect somehow. And so she just took it upon herself. So I think those are the main things, and I'll talk about like sort of that, creating that network of support and who are going to be those people you can count on a little bit later. But those are sort of the main things I wanted to say about my position.
Thank you. Should I jump in?
Yeah.
So I'm Bernadette. Nice to see all of you. I'm the head of creative nonfiction at the Antioch MFA program, and it's very different than Cynthia's experience, where I teach. A lot of what I do and how I'm judged and how I got the job has to do with my publishing history. So, and that's been the case throughout my career. When I left my MFA program, which I was a student with Danielle back in the day, we were classmates. I graduated in '99, and by the end of '99, by that December when I graduated, I got hired at UCLA Extension to teach there. So that was my first experience teaching. But by then I was starting to publish things. Then I got hired at Glendale Community College, and I taught there for a little while, and went on to teach for National University in their MFA program. I started to work as an adjunct at the Antioch program where I graduated from, which is mentor-based. And the reason I ended up getting a full-time job there ended up being totally a fluke. I wasn't sure that I was looking for a full-time teaching job. I really wanted to write as much as possible. I enjoyed teaching as an adjunct. I didn't think really that I was competitive as a going for a full-time position. One thing you should know also about our program is we don't have tenure. Our system doesn't believe in tenure. It's more, they like to think of themselves as more egalitarian. So I get a 3-year contract that's renewable every year for another 3 years. So I have some security, but I don't have tenure. We also don't have official titles other than core faculty unless you apply for rank. And a few years ago when I was looking for a salary increase, I applied for rank and got the rank of associate professor in order to justify a raise. But it's different than a tenure track position in that way. But I was interested in writing. I was working as a book critic for the LA Times. I was a freelancer for about 20 years as a writer, teaching on the side to help pay bills. And then one of the women who had the position I ended up getting at the university went on maternity leave. And they asked me to fill in for her while she was on maternity leave. So I thought it was just gonna be a short-term thing. I did it while she was on leave, and then when she was due to come back, she came back and said, actually, I'm not coming back, I'm moving to Santa Fe. And so then the position became open. And I ended up actually interviewing 3 different times before I got hired for that position. And we can get into that if you want, on all the hoops they can make you jump through. But so I'm there full-time now as a associate professor. And one thing that I like about my job is that there is a big focus on publication. So when if I bring in work to work on in the office, or if I'm dealing with creative writing of my own related things while I'm at work, nobody is disturbed by that. And my review process every year where we have to be evaluated, a big chunk of that has to do with what have you published this year. So there's a lot of emphasis on that in the world I'm in, which is good for me because it spurs me to keep doing the work that's really important to me. The drag about it is I work in a low residency MFA program, so our students are only on campus twice a year for 10 days each time. And then I work one-on-one with students when they're home, as they send packets to me, which means I'm not in a classroom as often as I would like. I enjoy being in a classroom, I enjoy that interaction, and it makes me feel a little rusty between residencies that I haven't been in a classroom lately. And a lot of my time when I'm on campus is spent doing administrative work, which is not my favorite thing. I'd much rather be dealing one-on-one and talking about words and should we have a comma here or not, and what's the structure, and I'd rather be in the creative side of things, and that a lot of times I'm on curriculum committees and hiring people and all that sort of stuff. I will say that I looked at this question as both an applicant for a job and being on a hiring committee. So I've been in both positions. not only for the job I currently have, but during the time I've been there, I've applied for other jobs and actually gone through that process with other jobs. So we can talk about that as well if you like. I will say, from being on the hiring committee side of things, I just did this. We just hired the person who was my counterpart in poetry at our program. And it was a really amazing experience for me because I'd been on hiring committees for other positions, but not for one specific to creative writing before. And what was amazing to me, and I don't want this to be discouraging, but how outstandingly credentialed the people who applied were. I was just blown away by how good everyone was. And then when we started doing the in-person interviews, I thought it would be, it ended up being actually a pretty straightforward decision because the person we hired was like so stellar, there was no question. But it was amazing to me how many really outstanding writers who had all the qualifications we were looking for were part of this pool. And in some cases it came down to things like me getting hired. I think in many ways came down to luck, that I happened to be in the right place at the right time. When they had this need, I was able to prove myself in the interim position. So when the position became open, like, I don't know, they would have hired me that easily to fill in for this woman for her maternity leave if they had known it was going to open up to another job. But by then I had had the chance to prove myself. So anytime you get the ability to prove yourself to whomever it is you might be applying for a job for, that can go a long way. So if that is adjuncting, if that is being on their, the literary magazine, whatever it is where you get a chance to sort of show them what you can do, that makes a huge difference.
Thank you.
Is that a good story?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you explain what a low residency is and how it's different from a full?
Yeah, sure. So a low residency program, instead of having all the students live here and attend turn in packets to that person wherever they are in the world, and they respond to those packets. So you're writing annotations, you're writing critical analyses, you're writing creative work, you're doing all that sort of stuff, but the interaction with the faculty member is one-on-one, rather than a faculty member addressing an entire class at a time. And that's the model. So we see the students 5 times, so 50 days out of a 2-year period, but the rest of it is done long distance.
Thank you. Cynthia, can you talk about the community college model and maybe how it's different from 4-year and why you were interested in being a professor there?
So I wasn't sure that I was when I graduated from Fresno State. I did know that I didn't like teaching at Fresno State because at the 4-year, they had a first-year writing program, which means we were required to use the same texts. There was a lot of like oversight over how we constructed our courses, and I don't play that game. I like to do whatever I want. So I was not a fan of that. So I knew that once I started adjuncting in community college, I was adjuncting for 3 years at Cerritos College and Long Beach City College. I understood that I had like complete freedom to do whatever I wanted with my classes, as long as I was meeting the course outline and the student learning outcomes. And that to me was like the main selling point. Once I was in community college, I absolutely loved it. So that's why I decided to apply for full-time, which doesn't one thing I don't want to forget to say is that you shouldn't be applying to a community college position if that's not what you want to do. Because one, I think that they're going to see right through that in an interview, unless you're a really good actor, right? They're going to see through that, and that's the kind of people they want to hire. They want to hire people who are committed to community college students and who really care about them, right? I'm not saying that I'm going to be at my school till retirement and this is life. But I'm just saying that I love what I do and I'm there for the right reasons, and they're gonna see that in an interview, right? So that's really important. And then the other reason was I really wanted to work with students of color. I went straight from high school to a 4-year university. I went to UC Santa Cruz, and my experience at UC Santa Cruz was rather uncomfortable most of the time. I was, a student of color at a predominantly white school, predominantly upper middle class, right, with lit emphasis that were horrible. Thank God they had creative writing, right, and that allowed me to graduate with a BA in English and creative writing. So it was a struggle to sort of make it through that program, and I knew that I really wanted to work with students of color, work with students and teach them writers of color, which I only had one professor in my entire educational career who taught me writers of color. So I was definitely going to be that professor, even if it's just me for students of color. So that's the main reasons why I chose community college.
Thank you. So a lot of people ask, I think a question we often get is, what's a curriculum vitae, what's a CV, and like what should go on it, and how is it different from a resume? Can you, wonder if you talk about that?
Sure. So a resume is usually more job related, not academic related. A CV is generally longer. Resumes are usually 1 to 2 pages and just give the positions in your education and maybe your objective. But a CV is going to list all your publications. It's going to list conference panels you've done. It's going to list all kinds of other things that wouldn't be on the resume. They're also incredibly long. I've now been doing this stuff for like 2+ decades. So I'm starting to have to pull things off of my CV because it's gotten way too long, and it makes me look old. So like if you see stuff I did way back in the day, you're like, oh man, she wasn't born yesterday. So I'm starting to call my CV, but my CV, if I do my full academic one, is probably like 10 pages. So they're very lengthy. Would you like that?
One thing I will say about that, right, I don't have probably as much experience as you do in terms of publishing or that career. So I know that, I imagine you get selective, right? You keep like the most important things, right? And you start taking out like little things. Like I think for me, right, I keep a lot of little things sometimes because I'm like, I don't have that long of a list, per se. And then as soon as I start getting something better, then maybe I cut a thing out here or there. But mine is still, let me see, is this double-sided? So mine is still 5 pages long, and it hasn't been updated. This is the one that I used when I got hired. So I have some copies if people want to share, and you all can. But this is the CV for community college. And you all could, there's not that many of that one. The printer at work was low on toner. But one thing I want to explain about this one is if you're adjuncting in any capacity right now or being a lecturer somewhere, a suggestion that someone, especially since I was at the very minimum qualifications of amount of years, I was at 3 years, a suggestion someone gave me to beef up my CV was list every class individually. And initially I had it where it was like by school all clumped together. So then that really made that portion of my experience look really small. Right? Even though I've been teaching for 3 years, 4 classes every semester, that's a lot of classes, right? But because I had clumped my schools together, it looked really small, my experience. So someone suggested to me, list them individually by classes. So it goes for 2 pages just on all the classes I taught in those 3 years, and allowed it to look like I had a lot more experience in teaching, and it was, relevant experience. I did have that experience, right? But it allowed me to showcase that experience. So that was a tip that was given to me throughout that whole application coaching process by someone.
And I just want to add to that, I have like 20 different versions of my CV depending on who I'm sending it to. So if it is for a teaching job, I'm going to start with, if it's a teaching job where they really put an emphasis on publications, I'm going to start, obviously get the education out of the way, but I'm going to start with my publications. If it's a teaching job that is more focused on how are you in the classroom, I'm going to start with my teaching experience. And I'm going to give more emphasis to certain things and less emphasis to other things depending on who my audience is. So I have a short CV, I have a longer CV, I have the full academic one. I also do collaborative writing, and so I've got one that's focused on collaborative writing, and it's again going to focus on the kinds of things I've done in that realm so that you can judge me depending on what you're looking for. So there isn't just one size fits all. I vary it depending on who the audience is.
I did all the documents, well, except for this one. Everything I brought is the original stuff I used on my application when I got hired. So I wanted you to see like what I actually submitted. So that's what the CV is.
So for community college, it would seem like your education experience, I mean, your teaching experience would be most important, right?
Yes and no. So if you're going to teach in an English department, I don't know if everybody here is English or not, but in English it's kind of tricky, especially if you have an MFA. So if you have an MFA in creative writing, as I do, you must have a bachelor's in English or you are not going to be able to get a full-time.
That's right.
That's a pretty scary reality, especially because so many people chose to go into creative writing afterwards, and probably like at my program we all taught, it was some more comp heavy than other MFA programs, I would say. Those are, I would say, the two most important things are going to be that you have those minimum qualifications of the 3 years, but you have to have either, if you have a master's in English, then you're good. But if you have an MFA in creative writing, you have to have a bachelor's in English in order to be able to get a full-time position. They have equivalency forms, but from my understanding, it's still very difficult for someone to make it through that application process with an equivalency form. I talked to my dean directly about it because I was trying to recruit people of color for our last hiring because we hired 4 people. And he was like, there was no way that someone, that's what his words were, that those were requirements of the state, that they have to have a BA in English if they had an MFA. That was sort of a roadblock I hit. Hopefully, that changes. And those of us who are full-time have the capacity to do that.
And I remember actually when that law was passed because I was teaching, my bachelor's degree is in journalism with a minor in English, and I was teaching for a community college. And then that rule came down. And I have another friend whose bachelor's was like in engineering who did an MFA. And he was able to get the equivalency because he was already teaching for them, and he's now a full-time professor at Pierce College. But that is something to know. The other way around that is if you're interested in teaching, you don't have a bachelor's in English, you don't want to go get an MA or a PhD, look at private colleges because they can make, what governs them is different than what governs the community college and universities.
Yeah, state schools, all state schools, if it's community college, Cal States, or the UCs are going to be under that requirement, the set standard requirements by the state of California. So that is going to definitely be a different ballpark.
And it is relatively unique to California because our students, we do a post-MFA certificate in the teaching of creative writing. That's one of the degrees or certificates we offer where we pair people up who have an MFA. They don't have to have done it with us. And we get them student teaching opportunities at USC, UCLA, different places like that. A number, or across the country because our students are all over the place. If they're not in California, they're not under the same guidelines. So if you are thinking, if you don't have a bachelor's in English, you are thinking this is your path, and you're always wanting to move to Vermont, that's another option.
I have a question just for the room. How many of you already have graduate degrees? Okay, how many of you have MFAs? Okay. Just so I know how to cater my answers.
Well, now I know I'll never teach at a community college. Because I have a BA in theater. But, so yeah, good to know. I'll be moving to Vermont.
But you could also be an adjunct, I believe.
Yeah.
No, you can adjunct. You
Yeah,
just
I mean,
can't get a
full-time,
full-time.
yeah.
At the time, for the time being, that is the standard. I mean, my objectives of how I wanted to enter community college system are pretty crazy, and so people are like, "Oh wow, you're keeping your goals low." I was like I want to completely radicalize how we look at that, right? Because how we look at people's, and we're changing as much as we can our hiring process, but we have those limitations, right, set by the state. So
Still talking about CVs, because you were recently on a hiring committee and you were talking about how a lot of these people were very fantastic.
Oh my God, yeah.
Besides the education and publications, like amazing publications, what's the next thing on the CV that makes you competitive?
Teaching experience. Like if you come in and you maybe have all the publications in the world, but you've never been in a classroom, like that's a problem. So we need to see the teaching experience. And for our program, because we are a national program, we're drawing students from across the country and around the world. We're looking for a national profile as a writer. So the person we ended up hiring for this position had a Guggenheim, had an NEA award, had like really top-notch stuff. And we looked at reviews of the books that the person had written, and the reviews were outstanding. So like it was hard, it was funny because at the time we were doing this hiring, we had asked some of our poetry faculty, who would you like us to bring in as really top-notch guests, because we were always bringing in guests for our residencies. And this name kept coming up, this is who we want as a guest, who we had brought in as a guest before. And the way she was described was like one of the most groundbreaking poets alive right now. And then that's who ended up applying for the job and got the job. So I mean, like we were like, can we get her as a guest? And then she wanted to actually come teach for us. So which I felt badly because when we did the actual search, there were plenty of people that I would have brought in for interviews, but we had like so many outstanding. And then even among the outstanding ones, trying to make the decision, there was a clear-cut decision way early on, but it felt really awful because these were other excellent candidates that we couldn't hire. So just know it's not you. That sometimes it's because I've been on the other side of it. I mean, I've been on the side where I didn't get the position and where I was crushed over things. And I always thought, well, I didn't prepare enough, or I don't have, and it's sort of like being an actor going for a role, like I was never going to be what this other person could bring. That was never going to happen. And maybe it was just for the best. But it's not, we were pained that we couldn't hire some of the other people because they were all outstanding. We would have liked to, but this one was so far, above the others that there was no question.
I think just to touch on that, I think also the point that Bernadette is making is like, sometimes you maybe shit out of luck because it can be just the application pool was that phenomenal, right? Like I think we all know those people. I know someone who's got the NEA, who got the Ruth Lilly, who got the Stegner. Like if I was in the application pool with that person, like, right?
Yeah.
So it's just like, if you're in that application pool, the competition just got real heavy.
Can we talk about cover letters? So how long, as I used to forever think that a cover letter had to be like a page, like a quick, but then when I started applying for things like this, I got word that it was like actually supposed to be more extensive and like a narrative. So can you talk about that? Like how should a cover letter look? How long it should be? How is it different from a CV?
So I would say dispel any ideas you have about cover letters, because the cover letters I saw from people who were full-time were all completely different. I was baffled at some of them. Like one of them read like a personal essay, like a nonfiction personal essay, and that was the cover letter. And I was so shocked, and they got hired with that cover letter, right? So I was like, probably that cover letter, they felt like they could go super personal narrative because their CV and their experience was like way super academic, right? So then they could do that. So I think it's a balance of like what you can do based on what your CV or experience is gonna show, right? I think someone like that, I mean, maybe they had a PhD, right? They had all this stuff going on and they were applying for a full-time position at a community college. So they went through like, get to know me through this cover letter, right? That's what their approach was. I did not do that approach. I also didn't feel comfortable doing that approach because I have an MFA. So since I have an MFA, the last thing I wanted to do was come off as a person who is not comp ready, right? So I steered clear of doing something that was super creative. So I do have copies, and there should be enough for everyone of my cover letter. It is dense. I don't even know. I actually didn't look at the word count, but this is my cover letter. It's size 11 font. I widened the margins like this, narrowed them so that it would fit and this is what I submitted when I got hired. It must be like over 1,000 words for sure. It's got to be like 1,500 words. Yeah, and so there's plenty of these to go around, and this is the one I used when I got hired. And I modeled this one after, in terms of thinking about it as a document I could use to provide as much dense information as possible. I got that idea from Leslie Tejada at West LA College because she had just gotten hired doing the same thing. She like narrowed her margins, right? She really like pulled those margins in super tight to get as much information as possible. Because if you don't have, I only had the 3 years experience, my goal was to teach them that I was super ready for this and that I was capable of doing this job, right? So that's what my goal was. So my cover letter is super dense. I copied it for you because I'm not one of those people who feels like, oh, this is mine, I created it, I can't share it. I mean, I really don't care, obviously. I mean, we all know not to plagiarize it. Especially not if you're applying to Fullerton College. But I think like, what I took from Leslie's for mine was I really focused on how she was structuring her paragraphs in her cover letter. What types of things she was including in her topic sentences, for what themes she was going to cover in those paragraphs. And I think that's the best way that you could use this if you're applying for a position, and sort of thinking about that structure and what kind of academic information you're trying to get in. One thing I will say about the cover letter, which you could just write on top, is you need to know what are all the latest academic terms in your field that you are applying for. What are all the latest trigger words that all the full-time faculty are using in those department meetings? You need to know that when you're applying, because I use them in here, right? And I got some of those words from full-time faculty members. The thing about it is if you're lecturing and you're adjuncting, nobody tells you anything, right? So nobody tells you anything, nobody's giving you this information, and it is really important for you to have those trigger words. So how many of you are interested in applying it to a community college? Okay, if you're interested in applying to a community college, you also need to write these two things on the top of that cover letter. So AB 705, it's a new California law. AB 705, you gotta know about it, you gotta talk about it. It means that in 1 year, students in California at community college must complete transferable English. It has gotten rid of sort of the gateway keeping, the remedial courses, they're all disappearing. So AB 705 is in full effect this year. So it is the new California law. It is actually, I think, phenomenal. The problem is a lot of community colleges are not prepared for it. Our school is, so I feel good where I'm at. But because we have embedded tutor courses, we already were doing open access courses that were trial run that are in approval for the state of California. We were already doing that. And statistics show that if you do an open access course, 72% of students pass the English 100. And if you do a placement course, 71% of students pass English 100. There's no difference. So I think this is a great law, but you have to know about it if you're applying at community college. The other thing there's a lot of criticism right now and super scary, and I don't know if I'm fully on board, but I gotta be whether I like it or not, is guided pathways. It's hitting community colleges super hard. Right now, the infrastructure for guided pathways is being created. So it's in the super blueprint stages right now. And what it's going to be is literally guided pathways, almost like those things they do in high schools. Like my high school had a health academy, a finance academy, and a tech academy. So essentially they want to do this to the community college. It is a super scary thing. And so my English department's approach right now is that they want to get in on the planning committee so that they can construct it to the best of the capacity for our students, because that's where all the money in California is going to go. It's going to go to these guided pathways, and they're going to cut everywhere else. So you need to know, kind of read up as much as you can, Google it, look online, see what's going on with guided pathways in California and in AB 705. If you're planning to apply to community college, you want to look appear to be as knowledgeable as possible on these two things because it is the future of community college in California. You had a question in the back?
I don't know what that is.
Guided pathways?
Well, that and like you're talking about the different.
So that's the only example I can give you. It's a blueprint right now. Essentially what it's gonna be is when community college students come in, they have to declare a pathway. And they're going to be on that track. It's to get them out in 2 years. And so it's kind of like that. I mean, that's how it feels to me, right? But the problem we see is like, what happens when they want to change their pathway? Right? Do they have to start all over? Are they going to drop out? Are they going to feel like it's too difficult to shift? Are they going to be like, let me get this degree in this thing I don't really want to do anymore, right? So that's the scary thing about guided pathways for me. But it is coming. There's a lot of money behind it. And that's important for community colleges because our funding is from the state. 70% of our funding comes from the state of California. So it's really, really, if not more, right? So it's super important that we figure out how to function with this. There's not a lot out there. Excuse me, there's things you can read online, but everything's super vague and has like a lot of metaphors of examples in it because they even came to do a presentation at our school because it doesn't exist yet. It's in the blueprint stages, but you should know about it if you're applying for community colleges. Do you want me to address the cover letter?
Yeah, so on my cover letter was actually probably longer than that, I gotta say, but I didn't try to fit it on 2 pages, I didn't do the margin thing. I think it was probably 3, maybe 3.5 pages, and a big section of it was about my teaching philosophy, and what it is about teaching that appeals to me, how I approach, how I teach, my engagement, and the university I teach for has a special mission that's tied to social justice, so there was a big section talking about my commitment to social justice, what that looks like, how I lived it out. And it tied in my publishing credits and my teaching as part of my literary citizenship and sort of approached it in that way. I didn't rehash a lot of what was in my cover letter or in my resume, my CV, because they would see that, but anything that was really crucial in sort of making it clear that my trajectory as a writer and as an educator there has been a path. It wasn't just that, well, I was a freelancer for a while and I was a book critic for a while and then I taught for a while, and I made it clear that it was all part of the trajectory leading me to this place where I felt ready to take on this position. But a big section was on my teaching philosophy.
Cool, thank you. So the next big thing I think people think a lot about when applying for jobs is the interview. So if you could share a couple of questions you think everyone should be prepared for if they're going in for an interview for one of these positions.
Sure. Well, the one thing I'll say, because you had sent these questions ahead of time, and I couldn't find one question that I got repeatedly from anywhere that I wasn't expecting. But I will say that a number of places that I've interviewed with, and I'll tell you what, the way it's been working, I don't know if this is everywhere, but the way it's been working in the searches I've been on and the searches I've participated in as an applicant has been that first I do a phone interview with the committee. Then if I make it to the next stage, we did a Skype interview. Regardless of whether I lived in that city or not, they wanted all applicants to be on the same platform, so we did it Skype-wise. And that was, those could be over an hour interview. And then if I made it to the next interview, I was invited to campus and I gave sample teaching. I was interviewed by the faculty assembly or whatever that group was. I was interviewed by the actual hiring committee. I met the president, I met the provost. It was a whole day thing of meeting different constituents and having them sort of judge me and me judge them. And I will tell you, I applied for a job 2 years ago that I made it to that phase. I was one of 2 finalists for this position. And I had thought, in fact, and I had to write up a proposal ahead of time. I had to do a whole bunch of stuff at each step of the way. And I was sure I really wanted this job. And I got there on the big final day, and they had me meet with other people who had similar positions at the university in different fields, but they were all in the arts field. And as they talked about their job and what they liked about it and everything, I realized in that moment, I do not want this job. And it was really interesting for me to, like, the light bulb came on, and I was able to sort of make it clear in the interview that, you know what, this is not going to be a good fit, you know, and that was the end of that one. So sometimes you don't know, because one of your questions was about fit. Sometimes you don't know until you get to that place. And what was the original question? Interview question. So one thing I have had happen on all of them, though, has been having them try to knock me off center with a question. Everything from a question about, we've had this issue among our students where one constituency says this, and it's caused problems and it's been a source of tension. How would you handle that? That kind of question that I wasn't prepared for. How would you, what would you say to the student who came to you and said X, Y, Z, but this other student said this, and there was conflict. For instance, in the creative writing realm, the use of the N-word in a class. One student feels like it's a reclaiming of a language, of a word that has been not used before, but is part of the original text. Another student's offended by that word. How would you deal with this conflict? I did have an interview one time with a woman who, in the interview, suddenly kind of attacked me. I disagree with that completely, and I think, and it became clear later, she was trying to see how I would respond if something became very hot. As an interviewer, don't recommend that, because I ended up taking that job and never trusting that woman ever again because it felt manipulative. But they may try to knock you off center to see, can you keep your cool? Can you remain articulate? Can you respond to this in a way that we agree with you on, and not get too flustered?
So I had a really pleasant interview experience, I feel, but I have heard of this. For sure they're gonna ask you the problematic student question. 100%, like hands down. They're gonna ask you, they're either gonna present you with a problem, or they're gonna ask you about a time that you had a problem with a student. So you present the example and then how you handled it. So they will 100% ask you that. They wanna know how you will deal with problems. But I have heard from people who interviewed at community colleges so many different stories of how these interviews have gone down. I know that one person who interviewed at Irvine Valley College said that there was a round where they timed you, and there was like a long table with all these papers on it, and they gave you a completely unmanageable task and a short amount of time for it, just to see how you handled the stress. So, I mean, different places are doing all kinds of different things, right? So, I definitely think that, and I feel like there was someone in my interview who slightly tried to be a little antagonistic with me, but it wasn't that intense. But that sounds more intense, but I have completely heard of this, the staged person in the interview who does something that would irritate you. Like, for example, I've heard of, like, while you're doing your teaching demo, someone taking a phone call in your interview, who is interviewing you. And that is, supposed to be staged, right? Because obviously they all know they're not supposed to do that. So I think sort of keeping that in the back of your mind, if you get to that interview, the person-to-person interview round, is that they might do something to stress you out, and to see how you'll respond. So that's really just important to think about. Some questions. So I have questions. So this is important about interviewing. So these are my flashcards that I used when I got hired. And my friend ran me through these interviews. My interview was at 7 in the morning. So I had to be on the campus by like 6 a.m. or something. 6:45 was like when I was starting. It was crazy. My friend ran me through these flashcards. Like, I created them the night before because my other system wasn't working. I'll tell you what that was. But she ran me through these, I would say, for 3 or 4 hours the night before, almost until midnight. And then I was like, oh my God, I gotta go to sleep. Like, tomorrow's the interview, right? But if she hadn't done that, I would have been really really awkward in the interview. And awkwardness will kill you in an interview. They want you to be as natural as possible and as comfortable as possible under this super nerve-wracking experience. And so what I had done initially is, so I had a friend who had been interviewed 5 times at different schools, and she had been collecting interview questions. And then someone else who I met also had been collecting interview questions from like 4 different interviews. Every time she got done with an interview, she went into her car and all the ones she could remember she was writing down. So I was given these lists, which I tried to find but couldn't find them. But I at least have the questions that were on my index cards. In the end, I was overly prepared for the questions because like they only asked me like 6 of all those 20 something questions. I had so many questions. But what I was doing at first was I like took a Word document, I typed the questions in, and I started like typing out answers for them, and that was messing me up. Because then I was trying to remember what I had written down, and then when my friend started going through the questions with me, she was like, girl, you are not ready. And she's from the nonprofit world, right? So she was, someone who's used to interviewing people, and she was looking for someone like, looking at me through that lens. And she was like, nope, you're not ready. And then I was like, all right, we need a new plan. And so I got the index cards out, and I just took put 3 bullets on each index card of like sort of what I really wanted to say about the question. And then that's what I ended up doing for the interview. But I did run through those. So the questions I have is, I had what classroom management problem have you had, and how did you deal with it? And that was asked. 100%, that question's going to be asked. What methods? I'll wait because I see people writing. And then this may seem obvious, and I would say prepare the most genuine answer you can for this, but they're gonna ask, why do you wanna work here? And they are looking for a unique and real answer. They're going to ask, why do you really want to work at this school? They're going to ask you that. And then they're going to ask what your teaching style is. So whatever, discipline, they're going to ask you that. What are your long-term goals as a teacher or educator? They want to know that. I think that they want to know those like, why do you want to work here, and the long-term goals, because they want to make sure that they're not a stepping stone for you. They don't want someone who they're going to keep for only a year or 2 years, and then they're going to leave. So even if that is your plan in some way, or you don't know what your plan is, right? You need to convince them that you're there, like till retirement. I don't know. Right? Like, you need to convince them that you're going to be there and that you're going to be there for a long time, because they don't want high turnover, right? They don't want to have to go through this process again for someone else. They are going to ask about your education and professional experiences that would be of specific value to whatever position you're applying to. So you have to cater your response to that position. And then those are the main ones I had. One that threw me off, and I was not prepared for, but I like do my best, is they asked me a question about teaching a literature course. I was applying for a position at community college, totally thinking comp 100%, never thought about that they offer lit courses, right? Of course they do. Or that I would probably eventually teach one there, right? And so I had to wing it on that one, and I could tell their faces at first. They were like, where is she going with this? And then afterwards they seemed relieved. I could tell that they were like, what is she doing, right? And then I managed to convince them that I knew what I was talking about by the end of the question. But they asked me a question, and I can't remember what it was, but it was about teaching a lit course. Like, if you were teaching a lit course, what text would you teach, and how would you critically analyze this text, to teach students about the meaning of this literature or whatever? And I was like, oh crap, I almost teach nonfiction almost all the time. So then I was super like thrown off. And I only teach like one fiction book regularly or at that time, and it was also the book I was using for my lesson plan. And I felt like super fucked right then. I was like, whoa. I was like, what am I gonna do? I was like, it's gonna look like I only know how to read one book. I'm like, that was literally the thought that went into my head when I saw the question. I was like, it's gonna look like I never read now. Because I haven't read anything recently that's fiction. And they're asking me a lit question. And I'm gonna have to use the same text. Because it's the only one I know well enough to answer this question right now. And so I was able to pull it off. But it was with Kindred by Octavia Butler, and I was able to pull it off, and I think they appreciated it, but I was thrown for a loophole with that one question. I wasn't prepared for a lit question. So at community colleges, one thing that's important to know is that, for example, at my campus, we're generalists. We all teach everything. There isn't like, oh, you have the MFA, you teach creative writing, or you have the master's, you teach. We're all generalists. We teach everything. So you get in a pool to teach whatever like lit courses you want to teach. You know, you get in a pool to teach creative writing. You can like, you won't always get to teach those things. It is comp focused, right? But we're generalists, so be prepared that they will ask you a question that's outside of comp if you're applying for a community college, right? And then, so one thing I was gonna say about the format, sorry, just one minute. Okay.
Yeah.
The format for answering the questions, literally every question you answer in an interview needs to be like topic, sentence, thesis. What is your ultimate goal or answer for that question first? Then a specific example using students' names if possible. If you don't remember the student's name, make it up. And then close your answer with coming back to that, what you ever said as your like topic sentence. That should be your 3 bullets for each of those questions when you prep. They are looking for a very specific student example with every single question at a teaching focused school that's student centered. So you need to have one specific example from students, and then like there was some where I couldn't remember the names, but I remembered the situation, so I made up the name, like whatever, right? They don't know anything, but maybe they know now.
So this has been awesome. We have a couple of minutes for questions. Ramona?
So how do you adjunct if you graduated almost 10 years ago? At a community college.
I don't think that that's a problem. I think that the problem is that right now all community colleges are losing students.
Well, let's just say.
So which means we have less adjuncts.
Right, but let's just say, forget about the realities of the system in California, just whatever the process is, how would one go about it? Is it just applying? Like,
You just put yourself in the adjunct pool. So when I graduated, it took me a year to find a job teaching. I came back from grad school to wait tables in a restaurant in Hollywood. That's what I did for a year. And my first teaching job was DeVry. Oh my God. And and then by the time that second cycle, like they do like 3-week cycles there or something like that. By the time the second one was over, I got in 2 classes at LBCC, and then 2 classes I'd interviewed, and I got in 2 classes at Cerritos. So I was like, goodbye, thank God, you know. And all I did was try to convince students to leave while I was there, because it's not a real education, right? But that was a year after graduating. So I would say put yourself in the adjunct pool. If you know anyone, right, who teaches at those schools, have them also like let the people know that you're in the pool, because at LBCC that's how it worked. Someone from Fresno, actually, who I know, was adjuncting there and gave the head of the English department my resume, and then like 2 weeks before the semester started, when everyone was already hired, they called to say that they quit because they got a full-time somewhere, or they just quit, and they had literally, it was like school was starting and they didn't have anyone. And they called me and they were like, can you do it? I was like, yes.
How about at Antioch? I mean, how long after you got your MFA were you adjuncting there?
Probably 6 years. But at that point, I needed to get, I was writing for the LA Times. I was a book critic for the LA Times. That was enough to get me teaching and publishing essays. That was enough to get me teaching gigs at UCLA Extension. Then I started at Glendale College with a similar thing, where I knew someone who taught there, who put a word in for me, and at the last minute they needed to fill a hole, and I was given a position to teach for them. But it took a while because Antioch, because an MFA program is looking for you developed as an artist, it took me a while to have enough publication credits to start teaching. Actually, I went back within the first couple of years to teach one-offs, and I was doing that. It was probably, I think it was around 2006, so about 6 years later, I started being a regular mentoring faculty. And then in 2010, was hired for the full-time position. But I had applied for that same full-time position 2.5, 3 years earlier, and it came down to me and the other candidate, the one who went on maternity leave later. It was me and this other candidate, who's now a good friend of mine, and I still think she doesn't know that I was the other candidate. But she got the job, and I was crushed, but I stayed on as a mentor. And then when she left on maternity leave, I stepped in then, and then had to go through the search. They did a search then for the full-time interim position, and they did a search for the full-time permanent position. So if you count the first time I applied for it, I went through the whole thing with phone interviews, Skype interviews, full day thing, going out to dinner with the committee, like the whole thing 3 different times before I got the job.
Wow.
Who's that right here? Yeah.
So I got my MFA, Bernadette guided me through, and I've sort of taken matters into my own hands, and to blow my own horn, I teach very successful workshops at my house, and they're awesome, and I get great feedback, and they work super well. But is that like, who cares? Does that go anywhere on a CV, or is that just in a cover letter?
In my world, it does count. So I was doing the same thing at the time I got hired. And because I had some limited experience. I had UCLA, Glendale College, National University. I had taught, but it was relatively limited. But I had also done quite a few years of these private workshops.
Yeah.
So in my field, it was fine to include that. They still wanted to see real teaching experience. I don't think they would have hired me if that's all I had. But it counted for something.
You would put that under teaching experience?
I put it as a separate private workshop.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm also currently teaching at UCLA Extension. Ironically, I want to be a creative writing teacher. I'm teaching the screenwriting program. Does that translate?
Yes. Yes.
Question over here?
Yeah, I would ask about literary community. One of the main reasons I'm considering, I have a master's in history, I don't have another names, considering that you're doing a little residency program. What you all said about never being able to adjunct kind of, went into my negatives of getting an MFA. But one of the main reasons I'm considering it is because I want more literary community. I want to have more writer friends. To write with, but also to chat with or drink with or whatever. And I wanted to know, as an adjunct, and from the perspective of faculty as well as from your MFA students, do low residency programs or any MFA programs and adjunct positions provide that kind of literary community, or do they not?
So the first thing I would say is it doesn't sound to me like you need to go to a graduate program. I personally steer everyone away from an MFA program having an MFA degree. And the reason why is because I think the community is everywhere. It's about attending open mics and going to events and like forcing yourself to be a little extrovert to meet people. When I moved to LA from graduate school, I hadn't been living in LA for 10 years. I'm from here, I'm from Inglewood, but I had been gone for 10 years. I didn't know anyone here in the literary world. And now I have a huge community because I was like, okay, well, there's this event happening. I'm gonna go here, I'm gonna go there, right? And so I would just go, right? And I mean, somewhere through there, that's how I met Sochi, right? So it's like, I didn't have any community, so I don't think that that's a reason to go to a program. If you wanna teach, I actually, at this point, would recommend doing your best to apply to a fully funded PhD program in creative writing. that's the downfall I'm seeing right now for myself, right? Because a lot of 4 years, if I do want to, I think if I want to stay in a creative writing program with publishing, I could get that job. But if I wanted to switch to teach English or something like that, it would be difficult at a 4-year without a PhD. Additionally, it's about a $20,000 pay difference at community college if you don't have a PhD.
Wow.
So I'm making 74 right now, and they're making like 95 for the same work. So if you want to even teach, and then if you go get a PhD, it doesn't matter what your other degrees are in. You can get a full-time position, right? But I wouldn't recommend getting any more debt either. I have $100,000 of debt. I have a ton of debt. So I would not recommend getting any more debt. I would, patience is a virtue if you're gonna get a fully funded PhD program, right? So I would find those programs, apply to them repeatedly, right? And make some decisions that way. I would not recommend getting into more debt if you already have debt. I don't know if I'll ever go get a PhD at this point in my life. If I do, it's not gonna be in English. I think I went in sociology.
I have the complete opposite answer.
Exactly.
But I'll tell you, I did my MFA with no intention of teaching. I do not have a bachelor's degree in English, and that wasn't a hurdle at the time. But I had no intention of teaching. I was hungry to understand how to put together a book. I wanted someone to take me by the hand and teach me how to do this, and I wanted community. And I did find that there. And in fact, Women Who Submit grew out of the Antioch MFA program, and it was started by a bunch of alums, and quite a few of them are here today, where we try to foster, and people have been very good at doing that on their own, a sense of community and belonging. But the reason for my MFA was I was so hungry for this information. I wasn't finding it elsewhere. As a creative writer, I had taken a slew of courses at UCLA Extension, and I was at the place where I was a mother of 3 young children, and I was about to lose my house to foreclosure. And when I had done my undergrad, which I paid for being a cocktail waitress and working 5 jobs to not get into debt, it was the first and only time I took out student loans was for my MFA. And my life changed radically as a result of having gotten it. I didn't know I'd end up teaching. I didn't know I was like the bio said, I was a weekly book critic for the LA Times before I graduated my MFA program because of what I did in my MFA program. So had I not taken those steps, my life would have looked totally different now than it does. That's not to say that happens for everyone, and I think that as a writer, if your hunger is writing related, you can learn the same thing on your own. It will just take much longer. So what I learned in 2 years, and maybe I would have learned in 10 years on my own, but I was at a position where I needed to know it now. I was not 20 whatever years old. I was in my 30s. I had 3 kids, and I knew at that point, I had always written, but I didn't know what I wanted to write about and what my subjects were. By that point, I knew, and I really needed someone to take me by the hand to make it to the next step.
And I have to agree, I went for writing. That's why I went to MFA. I had no idea that with an MFA I could teach community college. I'm a first generation college student. I didn't know any of this shit, And so I just went because I wanted more formal education in writing, and that's why I went. I finally was I think, understanding that I was really a poet, and that it wasn't just a hobby. Does that make sense? And then that's why I decided to go. And so my life is radically different because I went and got an MFA. But I think if I had just focused myself in writing, I would have got somewhere. But I'm glad I ended up where I went because I didn't know that Fresno State was a teaching-focused institution. So everyone there teaches in the MFA program. It's getting a little worse, I've heard, since I left. But mostly all the students get teaching experience there. And that's when I learned that I love being in the classroom. I didn't know that prior to that. So it was also life-changing for me, despite the fact that I discourage people from going. I think you really have to know why you're going. Does that make sense?
Thank you. So that's about all the time we have, but they're going to be here.
Yeah.
So we'll take a 10-minute break, 10-15-minute break, and then we're going to do, for people who are new, we'll have the orientation. It's about 30 minutes, and you learn about Women Who Submit and how to be a member. It's totally free. You don't have to pay anything, so it's totally free. So feel good about that.
If they want to ask us questions, they should do it in that next 10 minutes.
Yeah, 15-minute break, and there's coffee and snacks and some drinks, and you can come up and talk to them, and that's cool.
And then if you want a copy of this, I have my cards.